session of Irish History from the Hedgerow at the Irish Roots Cafe, produced by IrishRoots.com with Peter Reilly Adams and Michael OLaughlin. Find a spot on the warm, sunny side of the hedgerow now. Today's session is about to begin. They were rough, unpolished men, brilliant scholars, teaching by the side of the road, in small rooms, in nooks and crannies, wherever and whenever possible. Such men as these, they were the teachers of the hedge.
When I was a gossoon of 8 years or so, with me turf and me primer, to school I did go. Hi-dee-dee-dum-dee-dee-day. I went to a schoolhouse without any floor. Hi-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-day.
Welcome to another session from the Irish Hedgerow. We're continuing our talk on the Irish in the 1600s and some of the battles. And our last session, we had finished up on the Battle of the Boyne, and the troops were retreating. They were headed back towards Galway, in that little area where the British had sort of formed a pale for the Irish. Behind the Shannon River is where they'd put them, and they'd enforce the law a lot more stricter on the other side of that Shannon than the Irish side on the west. But that's where the Irish were heading, and the fighting was not over. There were still plenty of the flower of Ireland, ready to do battle, so they put it. And here they are coming back that way. Peter, what kind of sense do you get of what's going on now?
Well, of course, the battle was between the followers of William and those who were still resisting and tried to maintain for Ireland. You know, there's one of, you look at when James II's there, they're fighting for the throne. Well, the Irish were doing that because they thought that James on the throne would be kinder. Now they're also saying, wait, we're going to fight for our own independence. They're gone. The Williams boys are still here, and he's gone. But we're going to fight for ourselves, and we're going to fight for Ireland. And it almost makes like there's two things that were happening. One, of course, was to be a part of the battle and hope that at the end of it all, we would gain something because we would have a friend, so to speak, on the throne. The other is we have to do this by ourselves because we're not going to have any friends unless we own the entire idea.
Well, that's right. And where have we gone? Where are we going? There were several little decisions on what towns to defend and what towns not to defend. A couple of little stories come up to me that I'm thinking about. And one, you know, the Bridge of Athlone. There's even a dance about that called the Bridge of Athlone. And it's funny that you'd commemorate a battle like that. But the story, as I've read about it, it's really an amazing thing. It's an act of heroism and maybe an act of frustration and almost an act of last minute, really desperation's the best word for it. But there was this bridge that they were defending there in Aughrim, and they were keeping the other side, the Williamites, the English, out of the town, and they were defending it well. And then the British had come down and protected themselves, and somehow they laid planks over that bridge that the Irish had destroyed or disabled so no one could cross over it. And so with those planks laid down, the rest of that town was going to fall, and that would be disasters. And these folks decided, no, we're going to stop them, and we're going to stop them here. So 10 men and their commander, I think it was, rushed down to that bridge and tore the replacement planks out and were ripping them up and tossing them overboard, I assume, and had the job almost done until the last of them was shot and killed. And you think that might have ended the story, but 20 more men then came down with their commander, and they finally did the job, and I think every last one of them was shot too. But that gave them a few more precious days. Now, in the end, they did not cross on that bridge to make victory. The English didn't. They ended up going just a little bit away from that bridge and fording the river, I think is the way the story goes. But it sure was remembered, and although today we do a little dance about it, there's a story behind that dance, and I think it's good for everybody to remember that. Peter, did you remember anything that might have happened? You know, we were talking earlier about the Battle of Aughrim, And that was really the last big, great pitched battle that Ireland would ever see. And there were battles later, but not like this one. And we talked about the horse for the Irish did very well at the Battle of the Boyne. They would charge and come back and charge again, and sometimes there'd only be 3 or 4 men left from a whole group that was doing the fighting, but they just kept coming back, and they delayed the Williamites and saved a lot of the Irish infantry, fought very bravely. Now we come to Aughrim. The Irish again got to set up where they wanted to fight. They were on the high ground. They had some ditches and some nice natural terrain in front of them that they could defend well. So they picked a good spot, and you'd think it would have gone perhaps a little more in their favor, but it didn't. And it seemed that the Irish horse, and there was a lot of the old English families fighting with the Irish Catholic families that were England, and they were a lot of the mounted men, a lot of the horse, as well as Sarsfield. But it seems that they were disheartened, and as that battle went on, instead of riding forward into destruction, they held back a little bit, and that really turned the battle even further. And then the commander, the French commander that was helping them out, had told Sarsfield to hold his place and not move until he received a firm word on what to do. But then the French commander got killed by, I guess it was a cannonball or musket shot as he was leading a charge, and that left the whole thing unorganized, and nobody knew what to do. That turned the tide. And
well, the Irish were, when they first defended Limerick, they were encouraged that they could win the war with the help of France, But William leaves Ireland, and he left the Williamite forces under the charge of a Dutch general, Godard de Ginkle.
Ginkle, yes.
Yeah, Ginkle. And he broke into Connaught through Athlone. And so when you're talking about Athlone and that, and there was the bloody siege was there. And then they advanced on other strongholds in Galway and Limerick. And you mentioned about the French, and the Marquis de Saint Ruth was the Jacobites' commander.
Yes, he's the one that fell.
He's the one that fell, and he attempted to block Ginkle's advance at Aughrim in County Galway.
Yes.
Remember, now, Galway, of course, is north of Limerick. You have to wear the thing, and that's where Connaught is, in the part of the Gaeltacht there. But there was a crushing defeat. Ginkle's army inflicted a crushing defeat on the Irish at the Battle of Aughrim. And then the Jacobites, it's said, lost 8,000 men, or half their army, was either killed, wounded, or taken prisoners. So that's and the French general, the Jacobite general, we could say, was among the dead. And then Ginkle took Galway, and they surrendered on terms. And then they went back again to besiege Limerick.
That's right. And you might think the Irish would have totally given up, but there was still some fighting spirit in them. But I guess they were sort of boxed into a corner. You can see that Limerick is where Tyrconnell had established a vice-regal. And so here comes King William with some 20,000 army veterans, according to my reports. And Limerick had been well supplied from both Connaught and from County Kerry, and they had the best of the Irish troops on hand of the day, even though their equipment might not have equaled what the Williamites had. And they also said that in their support, the French fleet sailed freely on the sea, so they could be resupplied, or who knows, you might get some more troops dropped in. Now, the one great story I get out of this whole thing, Peter, which is sort of a bright spot for the Irish, was a daring raid made by Patrick Sarsfield. And that sort of talked about quite a bit. They had trouble taking the city. It just wasn't working for the Williamites. They had charged 3 or 4 times, breaking through the walls, and that didn't work. And they said the women had thrown stones and cups and whatever to them, and the women were standing closer to the enemy troops than to their own men, and they were just driven out of the city. So that shows you how hard these folks were fighting to hold on to Limerick. Well, Patrick Sarsfield got word that they were bringing up some siege machines, some bigger cannons, and maybe some battering rams, and that they had to stop that because it was coming up to meet Ginkle, I guess it was. Ginkle would have been in charge then, and he was coming up to meet him, and Sarsfield sent his men out, and they found that troop that was coming up about 12 miles from the Williamite lines, and it was night, and it was a clear night. There was a harvest moon, but they say they waited for the clouds to form up, and they started to proceed towards that camp quietly so as not to disturb anything. And the main story that was told about before that battle, one of Sarsfield's men had stayed behind. I think it might have been a lame horse, but he had ran into the wife of one of the men in the Williamite army, and he had actually helped her out and got her back to safety. And in return, he got the password that the Williamites were using for free passage. Now, I don't know if that wife of the Williamite soldier might have been a little mad at her husband for leaving her or what, but anyway, he got the password, and the password was Sarsfield. So as they approach this train, middle of the night, the Williamites are sleeping beneath their cannons, all's quiet. They come to the first sentry, I imagine in small groups, and just keep coming through, and they said, "What's the password?" Sarsfield. They let them pass. So that brings them down very close to the whole siege troop, the siege engines and cannons. They come to the next sentry. They halt them, and he says, "Yes, Sarsfield," and he lets them pass, and then they shoot that sentry, and they took every single man out of that whole caravan, and they destroyed the cannons, filled them to the brim, and fired them into the dirt, ruined the whole deal. It was a very daring raid, and very few times do you read about something like this being led by an Irishman in the war. So you can see why that gave the Irish maybe their only bit of hope during this whole thing, as everything else was defeat after defeat.
And then finally, the Irish saw it, even though they did have this somewhat of a victory. They realized that this was a never-ending battle, that they weren't going to be able to defeat the strongness, the strength, the vitality, the experience of the Williamite forces. And this then led up to a treaty.
Well, that's right. And there's a few other things. I tell you, as Williamite's troops were moving in and they were coming down, they needed to ford the river. They came across this one village they were heading to, and all the fishermen left because they got word that this great army was coming and they might do them harm. And it seems that one fellow stayed behind because he was feeling not right. Well, this fella had developed a reputation over the years after that battle. It seems that they had come, one story said they had come to his door and they left a block and an axe. And
That's McAdam.
Yes, yeah, McAdam, yes, yeah. And a little bag of gold. And they said, "Here's your choice. Your head on the block, or you take the sack of gold and you show us where to ford the river," since he was a fisherman. Well, however it happened, apparently he showed them the best place to ford that river, which was swollen at that time of the year, and there were also some nice rocks there that they could anchor whatever it is they needed to get across that river with. And the people didn't forget it. And in Linehan, in his History of Limerick, speaks about that very story, and he says it was about 1866, and he said the tombstone of Philip McAdam was still there at that time, and somebody had inscribed separately from the official inscription on it, and it said, "Here lies the body of Philip the traitor, lived a fisherman, died a traitor." And the people hadn't forget, and he said that up until recent times, people would come up to that graveyard and hurl insults at that graveyard. So people did not forget. I don't know exactly what the truth might have really been. Some of his descendants of the day had some papers, and they showed Linehan, and they said, "See, we owned this property before the Williamites ever came through." But I don't think the land was really the issue. It was who showed William the best place to ford that river. And this McAdam, it looked like he did. And on that tombstone, it had the arms of a cock at the top of it and a conventional inscription from his son. And we assume that second inscription was added. But that's quite a story, and that's just an example of how long some of these animosities last. And it's sort of amazing that they had those animosities, yet the same family still lived in the area in peace at that time.
You mentioned that there was a symbol of the cock, the rooster.
Yes.
You know, there's an old story about what does that mean, and go back to the scriptures that Jesus said to Peter, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me." So the crowing of the cock has been seen as a symbol of betrayal or remembering, don't betray me. And so that symbol on him may be a subtle way of saying this man betrayed his own people.
Well, that's very interesting. I never even thought of the second side of that coin, what it could have meant if it wasn't put on by himself, but was put on by the people.
Yes.
Very, very interesting. Gosh, are we up to, how about that terrible thing that happened at Limerick when they closed the door on them too early? Did you run onto that story? Well, it was the Thomond Bridge, I think they were calling it, and the French commander, he was in charge. Well, the brave troops that went outside the city walls to fight the Williamites got driven back by a superior force, and they were backed across the bridge, back to the city. But the French commander, I imagine in panic, closed those doors to the city and said, no, we'll fall. If we let these soldiers in, we'll fall. And so he kept the doors closed. 600 men were slaughtered on the bridge. 100 or so were drowned. Others were just outright killed. It was a sad thing. And, one wonders if an Irishman had been in charge of that drawbridge or those gates of the city, would he not have opened them up and let them come through? You'd think a little planning could have guarded that one entrance.
Well, part of the thing, we've heard of the people going into the gates and going to the cities, even back when we talked about the Vikings, that if you let them in through peace, then they wouldn't destroy everything. If you blocked them, then they were just going to destroy everything and kill everybody on the inside. And it's the talk, though, there was a popular Irish saying, I suppose, at the end of all of this. It said, remember Limerick, an English treachery.
Yes. And you've talked about that treaty stone, and they said when they signed the treaty, they did it in full view of both armies. Now, would that have been a moment in history to stand there against the men who were about to kill you, who had just killed your friends or your relatives, and you're both standing and you're watching that treaty? It's one way to keep a treaty in force by saying, here, you all witness this. We have declared peace. But what a moment that would have been if you can imagine two armies sitting there after killing each other for a long time, and making peace, and what would have been going through their minds.
It's just, it reminds me of a story, of course, in the United States when the South and General Lee surrendered to General Grant. And General Grant ordered all his troops to stand and salute General Lee. There's, on the other side, when you talked earlier about how there was a gentlemanly approach to battle even at times. And then, of course, there was terrible treachery. It's not to think that everybody was being so nice to each other, but it would be an amazing thing to see. But on the bottom line is eventually everybody realizes they're human. Your beliefs, but what I have and who I am, it's you have a family, I have a family, we have brothers, we have sisters. It's all a part of the humanness that we might and hopefully discover in each other, rather than just the peace should make us realize that. The battle's done. Some win, some lose. When they talk about that treaty stone, which, by the way, they also say reputedly was signed on the treaty stone, it's an irregular block of limestone, and they said it once served as a mounting block for horses. You get up on the block, get on their horse. And, of course, I've seen it. It's right there and on the pedestal there in Limerick City. And Limerick, by the way, is sometimes known as the Treaty City.
Yes, and what brought about the signing and the surrender of that city? D. Ginkle had returned with his army with 60 cannon and 19 mortar. And although Sarsfield had made a daring raid, it wasn't enough to stop an army of this kind of strength, and their writing was on the wall. So here it comes. The French, they signed this treaty. Sarsfield had sent somebody out to seek the treaty, the peace negotiations, and actually the terms were pretty good when you stop to think of it. They got to leave the city marching with their flag flying and their drums playing, and really maintaining a little bit of pride. And they were given the choice. They were actually supplied with transportation to leave to the country they wished. And they were given the choice of either leaving or making peace and joining the Williamite army, which seems a little strange to some people at times. Very few people actually joined with the Williamites, didn't they, Peter?
Did they what?
Very few people actually left to join the Williamites.
They didn't want, and what they did is that it was kind of a way of saying you have to give an oath of loyalty to William. And if you did that, and this was part of the peace idea, then we'll tolerate Catholics and give you full legal rights. So there's a number of things. I suppose, if you think about it, they would join the army because that was a job. At least they had something to do, and they knew they would be given provisions and some protection. But the other thing is that they were trying to put an end to this. They knew that it wasn't going to work. Sarsfield overthrew the French leaders and took over himself, and he's the one that entered the negotiations with Ginkle and decided, well, this is the best course for us to take.
And Joyce, in his Social History of Ancient Ireland, I think it was, one of his works, he said that 1,000 troops actually went over and joined the Williamites. And I know a lot of those were some of the horse regiments of the Old English. And 2,000 more got passes to go home. They chose neither way. They just wanted to go back. And you think at some of these troops, they would have lost their lands. They might have been now living in a mud hut without windows, lucky to have furniture. They had nothing. Their only hope was to win back the lands of their ancestors, their fathers, their grandfathers, no matter what that be, a small plot of land. And I think the theme of a small plot of land that you were in control of really came all the way across the ocean into America when the Irish arrived here centuries later.
It sure did. Have your own land, your own place. And part of our American idea is own your own home.
Yes.
Whether you can afford it or not, own your own home. When the talk about Sarsfield, they say that some 14,000 men and about 10,000 women and children left with Sarsfield. But they looked at the other consequences. What would I have if I might or might not have my land? And they were going to France, where they saw that they would be supported and at least have other things surrounding them and feel much more protected, because there was no doubt that what you have now is the Protestant ascendancy is taking over in Ireland.
Well, for all the dispersion that the Irish soldier, the Irish fighting man might have taken in Ireland for losing all these battles, when they left and went to France, they formed the Irish Brigades that fought so well in Europe. And I see these numbers and I find it hard to even imagine. They say roughly from 1640 to 1760, something like that. Almost 500,000 Irishmen fought in these brigades on the continent, and they fought well. And they helped change the course of European history. And that's because they became better trained, and they had the modern equipment, and they acquitted themselves well. But in Ireland, it just wasn't that way.
Ireland was kept under such control. And as the English then dominated, with James gone, William taking over, the Protestant ascendancy, which not only became a movement of where people went into Ireland, but also came to be understood as the people who were in charge. They let Ireland just kind of be quiet and settled it down, and they weren't going to grant the Irish anything to enable them to become great or to build for themselves and their own nation. They were now to be considered a part of the English throne.
And the town of Limerick, you take a look at that actual town after that battle, it was badly battered. There was cannonballs that had gone through and destroyed homes, and the poor ended up putting up huts by the wall because they couldn't afford to rebuild. The rich started to rebuild their homes, and they kept that town in good repair as a military station for 60 years. And I imagine that's because they didn't want anyone else to make a stand there against the powers that be. And there's one other story, and I read that this was in 1693 by one account, but a tower on the quay fell. It was loaded with gunpowder, and it exploded, and it killed and maimed people as far as a mile or more away. They said that 240 people were killed one way or other, either crushed or by rocks flying through the air a mile away because it had blown up so much. And some histories actually say that happened right after the battle, but I'm thinking that might not be right. It might have been a longer time after it, but that shows you they did rebuild that town, and it really stood as a memory. And I know in one of my early trips to Ireland, I stood over there by King John's Castle and saw that treaty stone, and one of the folks townspeople came by and explained and pointed it out to us and told it what it was, and we were just sort of in awe. You could almost imagine those two armies standing there looking as the treaty was signed.
And it's an interesting spot there, right on the Shannon River. That's where it is, right on the Shannon River.
Yes.
And you can actually, you could bend over and put your hand, if you wanted to, into the Shannon, and it's sitting there right on the edge. And you wonder, where were the armies? One was on the east, one was on the west. Where was the stone? Even though it's on the pedestal now, where was it then? And, of course, if you saw the size of Limerick today, you'd realize and you'd be wondering, where did they do this? Where was it? And it's all it was all around the river, And then King John's Castle's right there on the river also.
And if you looked at the Treaty of Limerick, that treaty that they signed, there was actually a few phrases or one particular phrase that became known as the missing clause, because as it came time to be ratified, they left that out, and I forget which clause it exactly was, but it pertained to the freedom of the Catholics for sure. That much I remember. And in 1703, they had an act that in Limerick, no Roman Catholic strangers could reside there, and if you were currently a Catholic, you had to prove your loyalty one way or the other. I don't know exactly how they did that. I guess you might have to have somebody vouch for you who was not Catholic. And there was also that oath of allegiance that came back into play. And according to that Treaty of Limerick, you had to do the oath of allegiance, but you didn't have to do the oath of supremacy, which would give you a little bit of religious freedom there to become a citizen, so to speak, have some rights without decrying your religion.
Oh, sure. But they did think that it was going to grant to the Catholics some rights, but it is the civil articles were not honored by the victorious government of the Williamites. And part of the reason is that the papacy, again, decided to recognize James as the lawful king of Ireland. And few Catholics took that oath, and they remained protected, actually, and some of their descendants were. But then the penal laws came, and that's for another session that we'll look into.
Well, those penal laws are one of the big reasons that hedge schools came about, and that's really one of the reasons we're here today, if you look at it in the big picture, because we've started this hedge school to get the word out there, and it's really an inspiring story of the fight for freedom and knowledge. Do we have any other ideas of, as we wrap this century up, we've got maybe 3 minutes here, the things that, what's the summary of that century? I know that, if you take a look at Ireland at the beginning of the 1600s to the end, now there's a system of law, one system of law and standard local government. Public order was sort of established, but established through tyranny, really. And the Irish would be biding their time for maybe 100 years.
It was a terrible century of bloodshed and abuse by the English, using everything they could imagine. And Ireland was to go through some more struggling and terrible things. But, if you think about, and Irishmen know all of this, what they saw themselves going through as a people strengthened them for what they would become as a people. Eventually a unity, even though today there's a separation. But there may be a separation in terms of the government north to south, but there's no more borders, and it's all kind of like, that's over there and we're here. It really doesn't matter because we all know we're Irish.
Well, yes, and you talked about the travails. Well, now only about 1/7 of Ireland remained in the Irish hands. They held that land, only about 1/7 of it, so that really life had just totally been turned on its head. The Irish, who had held most of the land, now had held very little, and what they did hold was usually the poorer tracts of land, and that was nothing to shout about, that's for sure, especially if you've been over there in the Burren and you've thought about, well, how could a man raise a crop of potatoes to feed himself there?
And go back to the saying from the Cromwellian period, to hell or to Connaught. And Connaught is a rocky, barren place.
Yes.
Yet in the Burren, which is in Clare, but also then out in Connaught where you have other barons. It's amazing the wild flowers that grow. And that's kind of what the Irish are. They're this wild flower. They're going to grow, whether or not they have all the support and the maintenance that comes with so much beauty. It's still there, and they're still growing.
Well, and I'll just mention, talking about those landowners, County Kerry had 540 Catholic landowners in 1641 and almost none by the end of the century. And Wexford, who's going to come into play 100 years later, had 157 landowners in 1641. And, of course, that's one of the places Cromwell hit the hardest. And now there were none, not one on the books. So that's a stark realization of what happened.
And we'll see in the next century how it was very peaceful and calm for an awful long time. In the English throne, after William died, his sister-in-law became queen. And then after her, the house changed and it went over to the Germans. The first part of the English throne, actually George I and George II, which we'll find in another century, they didn't even speak English. Well, they had to learn it when they became on the throne. So Ireland became less important for the English as they were concerned with other things. And then eventually the Irish, once again, as the thoughts of democracy grew, as the American Revolution came up, as the French Revolution came up, then there was another rising in Ireland at the end of the 1700s, and we'll be looking at that later too.
Yeah, and it's funny, the movies show all the kings of England speaking with a perfect English accent, and that wouldn't have been the case at all. Things weren't quite as tight as the way they said it was.
Not at all. You think, William, he's from the Netherlands. Okay?
Yes.
Even if you look at it, if the accents, of course, what we hear today and what was then may be different, and if you look at James, well, they were from the Scots. And then again, as I say, we move after Queen Anne, who succeeded William, and she also was the daughter of James II. Then the throne had to go to a cousin. And the cousin, it had to be the Parliament. There were 56 other heirs to the throne. Mm-hmm. There was one problem with them. They were Catholics.
Yes.
They had to go find a Protestant heir for the British throne, and so, I guess, say, the drama continues.
And Parliament was all Protestant after that.
Yes,
after all this
completely.
So that sort of opens up the 18th century to a world where the Irish have been totally suppressed, and Parliament and politics is totally against them. And we're going to hear more about that story in our next session, but we sure thank you for joining us here today for another lesson from the Hedge.
Keep the turf fires burning. We'll be talking with you next time.
So ends this chapter of Irish History from the Hedgerow. The entire series is available at www.irishroots.com. We have broadcast series on genealogy, song, local history, as well as original publications for every county in Ireland. The Hedge School in Ireland was totally reliant upon the local community to survive, just as we are here today in our modern-day Hedge School. If you believe in what we are doing for your community, please do send us your support. You can sponsor a session of Irish Hedgerow history for as little as $100 and become a recognized scholar of the Hedge. You will also receive a pass or letter of introduction from the instructors here at the school, as was the custom of the Hedgerow. So keep the hedge growing with your donation, subscription, or membership. Thank you. We have been available for speaking engagements, exhibits, tours, and educational events since 1984. You can reach us at the Irish Roots Cafe on Twitter and Facebook, and on our homepage at www.irishroots.com, by mail at our U.S. location, the Irish Roots Cafe, Box 7575, Kansas City, Missouri 64116. Leave a message on our phone recorder at 816-256-3360. Copyright 2009.